They marched in silence, boots striking against the muddy road of March 1945. The women were young, some barely in their 20s, wrapped in ill-fitting gray uniforms or tattered coats scavenged from bombed-out depots. They had been nurses, clerks, auxiliaries in the Reich's war machine, and they had been told 1,000 times what awaited them if they fell into enemy hands. Whips, starvation, humiliation. The propaganda painted Americans as monsters who would strip them of dignity and grind them into the dirt. Yet as they reached the camp gates in Kansas, the world inverted in a single, breathtaking instant. The gates did not open to cruelty, but to a scene so ordinary, it was almost surreal. Long wooden tables lined the yard. On them were baskets of white bread, thick slices of meat, fresh milk in glass bottles, even apples shining red in the spring light. The women froze. For a moment, no one moved. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Yet disbelief held them still. One nurse whispered to another, "Is this for us?" It was not just food they saw. It was proof that everything they had been told about America might be a lie. Behind the tables, American guards stood calmly, rifles slung but not pointed. Some looked tired, others even friendly. One guard, a young man from Nebraska, motioned them forward with a nod. No shouting, no striking, no parade of punishment, just the smell of bread and coffee drifting across the yard. For women who had trudged across ruined Europe, who had seen Berlin darkened by nightly blackouts. This moment hit harder than any speech. The contrast was almost unbearable. In Germany, a family could wait weeks for a small ration of butter. Here, butter was spread thick across bread given to prisoners. At home, blackout curtains sealed every window. Here, electric bulbs glowed over the camp kitchens without fear of bombs. The world seemed upside down, and in their shock lay the first crack in the walls of belief that had imprisoned them long before barbed wire ever did. This was the true beginning of their captivity, not in chains, but in a paradox. How could captivity feel freer than the life they had left behind, and if their leaders had lied about America? What else had they lied about? The silence of that question was louder than any guard's command. The voyage began under a gray European sky. The women were herded onto vast American transport ships, vessels so enormous that many prisoners whispered they looked like floating cities. The clatter of boots on steel decks, the smell of salt air, and the hum of engines filled the silence. For many of these women, it was the first time they had ever seen the open ocean. The Reich had promised dominance. Yet here they were, powerless, staring across waters that belonged entirely to their captors. The crossing itself became an education. Every morning, mess lines formed, and to their astonishment, the meals were not thin soups or stale crusts, but steaming trays of potatoes, meat, and even fruit. A German clerk, once assigned to the Luftwaffe offices in Berlin, wrote in her hidden notebook, "We ate better at sea as prisoners than my family at home with ration cards." That thought haunted her each night as she lay in her bunk, listening to the endless rhythm of waves slapping against the hull. Statistics tell the story too. By the summer of 1945, nearly 370,000 German prisoners had been shipped to the United States. The logistical scale was staggering. Entire convoys guarded by destroyers, thousands of men and women carried across the Atlantic in weeks. For the prisoners, the scale alone was stunning. They had been taught that Germany was an industrial colossus, yet here they were, passengers in a system that seemed to move people and supplies with effortless power. At night, the prisoners gathered on deck when the officers allowed it. They looked out at the horizon, where American naval vessels escorted them in perfect formation. One woman muttered to another, "How many ships do they have?" It was not a question of fear alone, it was disbelief. Germany could not have mustered such an escort even in the war's early days. For the women, the journey was both terrifying and strangely liberating. They were leaving behind bombed-out cities, the hunger of ration queues, the blackouts that had become normal life. Ahead lay an unknown land, but also a chance, perhaps even unconsciously, to see the world beyond Nazi promises. On the final day at sea, when the Statue of Liberty appeared faintly in the distance, a hush fell over the deck. It was not celebration, nor defiance, but a silence thick with questions. How could a nation fighting a global war still project such abundance and strength? And what did that mean for everything they had once believed about their own country's destiny? The first nights inside the American camps were filled not with terror, but with disorientation. Barbed wire surrounded the compounds. Yes, but what lay within those fences contradicted every expectation. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows, their interiors lit by steady electric bulbs that hummed quietly above the bunks. To women accustomed to blackout curtains and candlelight, the simple glow of a light bulb felt like a luxury reserved for another world. It was the details that struck them most. At dawn, the smell of coffee drifted across the camp kitchens. For German women who had not tasted real coffee in years, forced instead to drink bitter substitutes made from roasted barley or chicory, the aroma alone was enough to make them pause. In the canteen, metal trays were filled with bread that was soft and white. Unlike the coarse, dark loaves back home, sometimes there were boiled eggs, sometimes oranges, sometimes thick slices of cheese. One prisoner wrote in her secret journal, "An American worker's lunchbox holds more variety than my father's table ever did." The rhythm of camp life surprised them further. Guards permitted music in the evenings, and soon a mandolin appeared, passed from hand to hand. A few women hummed old German folk songs. Others even tried American tunes they had overheard. There were books in the small camp library, English texts. Yes, but also German classics left behind by earlier prisoners. For those who had expected cruelty, the chance to sit under a lamp and read Goethe felt almost like stepping back into a university seminar. Even gossip became a kind of liberation. In one corner of the barracks, women whispered about a guard who whistled while he worked, or about the sight of American women entering town in bright-colored dresses. To them, it was a spectacle. How could Americans, in wartime, still live with such brightness? Statistics added weight to these impressions. In 1944 alone, the U.S. Department of Agriculture reported harvests so large that food surpluses filled warehouses. Even during rationing, Americans consumed on average 300 to 200 calories per day, nearly double what civilians in Germany received. For the women POWs, these numbers were not abstract. They tasted them in every meal. They saw them in every glowing light bulb. By the third week, the paradox deepened. They were prisoners, yet they slept with full stomachs. They were behind wire, yet they felt more secure than in their own bomb-shaken homes. Each detail, a tray of milk bottles, a guard's casual laughter, a song strummed on the mandolin carved away at the image of America the Reich had fed them. It left a question lingering in the silence of the barracks each night. Was this captivity? Or was it a glimpse of a freedom they had never known? By the fourth month, the camps no longer felt like places of silence. Instead, they echoed with debates that began after lights out, whispered at first, then rising into heated exchanges across the rows of bunks. For the German women, captivity did not erase ideology overnight. It magnified the cracks already forming in their beliefs. One evening in July 1945, in a camp outside Texas, a young Red Cross nurse named Liesel insisted that the Reich was betrayed from within, that Germany had been strong, but stabbed in the back by traitors. Across from her, a secretary from Munich named Helene shook her head. "Look around you," she whispered fiercely. "They give us milk every morning. They treat us better than Berlin ever treated its own. How can you still believe their lies?" The other women listened, some nodding silently, others frowning in stubborn defiance. These arguments were dangerous, though not in the way they had expected. No guards intervened. The danger lay in the unraveling of certainty. Many of them had entered captivity clinging to the notion of superiority, Aryan strength, German discipline, the inevitable triumph of the Reich. Yet each plate of food, each glimpse of American workers arriving at the camp gates in clean clothes, chipped away at that story. There were also moments of awkward silence that spoke louder than shouting. When an African-American soldier entered the camp as part of a work detail, some prisoners stiffened. Nazi propaganda had painted people of color as inferior, but here was a man in uniform, paid, respected, guarding them, and they were the captives. A few women lowered their eyes, unable to reconcile the sight with what they had been taught. Later that night, in the barracks, gossip swirled. One woman muttered, "If what they told us about race is false, what else is false?" The contradictions piled up. Guards allowed them to send letters home, though censored, and when replies came back, they often told of German cities flattened by bombs, families still waiting for food. In one corner of the barracks, A teacher's widow read her letter aloud. "My children sleep in a cellar. We trade soap for bread. Yet here you say you are warm and well fed. How can this be captivity?" The women fell silent, each sentence driving home the bitter truth. Statistics underlined their debates. By 1945, America's war production had reached 96,000 planes, 49,000 tanks, and 27,000 ships in a single year. Germany could not match even a fraction of that. These numbers circulated like whispered rumors, reinforcing the sense that the Reich had never stood a chance. Arguments turned into nightly rituals. Some ended in tears, others in stubborn silence. But each quarrel was more than just words. It was a sign that their beliefs were unraveling, one conversation at a time. And always the question hovered in the darkness: when the world you were raised to believe in collapses before your eyes, what do you cling to next? The true voices of the prisoners emerged not in arguments, but in fragile notebooks hidden beneath mattresses and letters smuggled past the censors. It was here, in ink and whisper, that the women revealed the raw contrast between belief and lived reality. A diary entry from a 22-year-old typist named Annalise read, "I saw a factory worker today open his lunchbox 2 sandwiches, cheese, an apple, and even a small piece of cake. At home, my mother waits hours for half a loaf of black bread. How can this be? We were taught they were decadent, weak, yet here, even their ordinary man eats like a baron." Her words carried not anger, but disbelief, like a child discovering the world is larger than she had imagined. There were lighter whispers too, fragments of gossip that circulated through the barracks. Some women joked about the American guards' accents. Others laughed nervously about the sight of women in town with bright lipstick, riding bicycles with skirts that flowed in the summer wind. They look like they live in peace, even though their husbands are at war. One prisoner muttered with envy, to German eyes, accustomed to patched uniforms and grief-heavy streets. The ordinary joy of American women seemed almost scandalous. Letters home often deepened the contrast. One surviving note from a camp in Illinois described, "I walk freely inside the fence. I eat 3 times a day. I read books by lamplight. Yet I know you sit in the cellar during raids, waiting for news." These sentences, carefully written, carried a sting of guilt. Captivity had given them more comfort than freedom ever had in the Reich. The camp authorities knew these words mattered. American officers quietly collected excerpts, filing them as evidence of psychological shift. By 1946, some 15,000 pages of diaries and letters from POWs were preserved documents that revealed more about human change than any interrogation could. But within the barracks, the words served a different purpose. They were confessions. They gave shape to feelings too dangerous to speak aloud in front of the loyalists. And they sowed questions that spread like sparks. How could the Reich declare itself the master race, when the so-called enemy lived in greater dignity than they ever had? Here, I want to ask you, the audience, a question. Imagine being in their place, seeing your entire worldview overturned, not by speeches, but by the food on a stranger's plate, or by the glow of a light bulb. Would you cling to the old beliefs, or would you let them go? By late 1945, news began filtering into the camps with devastating clarity. Newspapers brought in by guards, film reels shown in makeshift halls, even letters from relatives back home all told the same story: Germany lay in ruins. Hamburg's port flattened, Dresden consumed in fire, Cologne reduced to skeletal towers, more than 3.6 million homes destroyed, millions of civilians displaced, for women behind barbed wire. The irony was bitter. They lived as prisoners, yet slept in safety, while their families outside lived in cellars, or not at all. Then came revelations that struck even deeper. The Allied newsreels shown in some camps unveiled images of concentration camp skeletal bodies, piles of shoes, faces behind wire that mirrored their own, but carried unspeakable suffering. Some women wept openly, others refused to look, insisting it was staged propaganda. Yet doubt crept in, uninvited. If America had lied less than Berlin, if their enemy treated them with food and dignity, then what could be believed anymore? A sergeant overseeing one Illinois camp recorded in his report, "The female prisoners whisper among themselves after each showing. The younger ones fall silent, as if realizing for the first time what their nation has done." That silence spread, heavier than any chain. The statistics were overwhelming. By war's end, Germany had lost over 5 million soldiers, its cities bombed into dust, its economy shattered. Meanwhile, America had expanded, producing more than 2,000 tanks each month, building a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, feeding not only its own population but millions of Allied troops abroad. The contrast was too stark to ignore. Inside the barracks, ideological lines blurred. Some still clung to the belief that Germany's cause was righteous, muttering that reports of atrocities were exaggerations. Others began to confess their shame in private. Helene, the Munich secretary who once argued so fiercely, wrote in her diary, "We called ourselves superior, yet I stand here, a prisoner, eating bread softer than my family has ever known. The Reich gave me only fear. These Americans, my captors, give me freedom I never imagined." These were not the words of surrender in battle, but of surrender in spirit. Essay. It was not tanks or planes that forced this change, but the simple fact of dignity offered without demand, compassion, abundance. And even the casual laughter of guards became a weapon stronger than any artillery. And so I turn this question to you, watching now if you were one of them. Would the sight of America's abundance fill you with admiration, or would it harden into resentment? Which emotion is stronger, envy or awakening? The return came slowly, carried out in convoys of trains that wound back across Europe. By late 1946, most of the women POWs were repatriated, stepping off American ships onto docks scarred by war. The home they had longed for no longer existed. Cities they remembered as bustling centers were hollow shells. Families were missing, fathers killed, brothers unaccounted for. The streets of Munich, Hamburg, and Berlin smelled not of bread and coffee, but of smoke, rubble, and despair. For many, the shock of return was harsher than the shock of capture. Inside the American camps, they had lived within boundaries, yes, but they had eaten regularly, read by electric light, even hummed songs after dinner, now in their own homeland. Scarcity reigned. Mothers queued for hours for a handful of flour. Children scavenged ruins for coal, and women stitched clothing from curtains. One diary fragment from a former POW captured the bitterness I thought I was coming home. Instead, I came to a graveyard. In captivity, I was fed. At home, I starve. And yet, beneath the grief, something endured. The memories of America, ordinary. Unremarkable to the guards who lived them, had lodged deep in the minds of these women. The sight of children playing on lawns without fear. The taste of fresh milk poured without hesitation. The glow of light bulbs burning late into the night all became symbols of a life they could scarcely imagine, but could no longer deny. Some carried these impressions quietly, never speaking of them. Others told their children, weaving stories of paradox, of how captivity had opened their eyes to freedom in post-war Germany, where hunger and rebuilding consumed every day. Such tales sounded almost unreal, yet for those who had lived them, they were undeniable. In the end, the greatest transformation was not in numbers or statistics, but in perspective. They had entered the camps expecting cruelty, and they left them understanding that dignity could be a weapon sharper than steel. And so, we close with an image. A German woman, back in her ruined hometown, places a battered notebook on a windowsill. The pages are filled with her secret camp writings, descriptions of food, of lights, of songs. Sunlight filters through the broken glass, warming the paper. She does not open it. She only lets it rest there, proof that even in defeat, even in captivity, she discovered a freedom her homeland had never given her. History often lingers in grand statistics: millions lost, thousands of tanks built, cities leveled in days. But the story of German women POWs in America is quieter, subtler, and perhaps more enduring. It is a story not of battles fought, but of beliefs unmade. These women entered captivity fearing chains and cruelty, and instead they encountered paradoxes, freedom inside fences, dignity within defeat, abundance in the hands of their enemies. They ate meals that eclipsed the tables of their own families. They read books under steady lamps while Berlin lay in blackout. And they heard music float across barracks that should have been filled with silence. Each detail was small: a lunchbox, a bright dress, a glass of milk, yet together they became weapons sharper than any bayonet. For many, the greatest shock was not America's strength, but America's ease. A nation fighting a global war still overflowed with food, light, and laughter. These ordinary comforts forced comparisons that stung deeper than propaganda ever could. How could a superior race find itself poorer, hungrier, dimmer than the enemy it scorned? The question could not be silenced. Their journey did not end when they left the camps. They carried back memories that would haunt them as Germany rebuilt from rubble. Some buried the experience in silence, ashamed to admit that their captors had shown them humanity. Others passed it on quietly to children, planting seeds of doubt that grew into new values in post-war life. In this way, the truest battlefield was not across oceans or in ruined streets, but in the minds of those who discovered a different way of living. Perhaps this is the lesson that lingers, that compassion and abundance can dismantle fanaticism more powerfully than bullets, and perhaps that is why, even decades later, former prisoners still remembered the sound of guards whistling, the glow of electric light, the taste of fresh bread, symbols not of defeat, but of an unexpected freedom discovered behind barbed wire.